The doctor looked at Megan like she was the problem. "Mrs. Katz," she said, "both your children are dying. And the only donor match is the father who's been dead to them for 9 years. Except Rick Washington wasn't dead. He was bleeding out 3 floors below her twins' ICU rooms. And the choice wasn't Megan's to make anymore. It was his." The man who walked away when she told him she was pregnant now held her children's last heartbeats in his hands. And God help her, she had to let him. This is the story of what happens when the man who destroyed your family becomes the only one who can save it. Megan Katz had always hated the smell of hospitals, that antiseptic sharpness that clung to your clothes long after you left, the kind of smell that meant something had already gone wrong. But she'd never known fear like this. Not when she'd given birth alone. Not when the bank threatened foreclosure. Not even the night she'd packed her bags and left Rick Washington asleep in his penthouse, her future crumbling but her dignity intact. This was different. This was both of her children. The call came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that had started like any other. Megan was restocking shelves at the diner, her phone buzzing in her apron pocket. The school nurse's voice was too calm, too careful, the kind of calm that meant someone was trying not to scare you while delivering news that should terrify you. "Mrs. Katz, Stephen collapsed during soccer practice. We've called an ambulance. You need to meet us at Street Helena's." Megan's hands went numb, her vision tunneled. She was already running for her car when the second call came. Different number, different voice, same nightmare. "This is Principal Morris at Riverside Elementary. Your daughter Angela fainted in the parking lot. The paramedics are with her now." Megan didn't hear the rest. She was already speeding through traffic, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Stephen at the middle school across town. Angela at the elementary school 15 minutes in the opposite direction, both down. Both at the same time. It couldn't be a coincidence. By the time Megan reached Street Helena's, 2 ambulances were already in the bay, lights still flashing like silent screams. She stumbled through the automatic doors, her voice cracking as she shouted at the triage nurse. "My children, Stephen and Angela Katz, they were just brought in." The nurse's face shifted into the expression Megan would come to recognize over the next few hours. Professional sympathy with an edge of urgency. "They're being stabilized now, Doctor. Mendoza will be out to speak with you shortly." Shortly felt like drowning in slow motion. Megan paced the waiting room, her sneakers squeaking against the linoleum, her mind spinning through every terrible possibility. She thought of Stephen's laugh, loud and bright, the way he threw his whole body into it. She thought of Angela's art projects covering their refrigerator, her fierce little scowl when she concentrated on getting the colors just right. She thought about losing them both and felt her knees buckle. A hand touched her shoulder. Dr. Mendoza, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the posture of someone who delivered bad news before, guided Megan to a plastic chair that felt like sitting on a block of ice. "Mrs. Katz, your children are stable for now, but I need you to listen carefully." Megan nodded, though nothing felt stable, not her breathing, not her pulse, not the ground beneath her feet. "Both Stephen and Angela are experiencing acute heart failure. We've run every test, and the diagnosis is congenital cardiomyopathy, a condition that's been dormant since birth, but has now progressed rapidly in both of them." Megan's throat closed. "Both? At the same time?" Dr. Mendoza's expression was grave. "It's extremely rare, but not impossible with identical genetic markers. The concerning part is how advanced it is. Without intervention, their hearts will continue to deteriorate. So we intervene." Megan's voice came out harder than she intended, desperation sharpening every syllable. "Surgery, medication, whatever it takes. They need transplants, Mrs. Katz, both of them. And we need compatible donors immediately." The words landed like a fist to the chest. Transplants, both of them, immediately. Megan heard herself asking questions about wait lists, about survival rates, about whether there was any chance at all, but it all felt distant, like she was listening to someone else's tragedy unfold. "We've already contacted the Regional Organ Network," Dr. Mendoza continued, her voice steady but not unkind. "But I have to be honest with you, finding one compatible donor is difficult. Finding matches for both children, especially on this timeline." She trailed off, and the silence finished the sentence for her. Megan sat there, staring at the scuffed tile floor, at the worn-out waiting room chairs, at the vending machine humming in the corner. Somewhere in this building, Her children were hooked up to machines that were doing the work their hearts couldn't. Somewhere, a clock was ticking down to a deadline she couldn't see but could feel in her bones. "Can I see them?" Dr. Mendoza hesitated, then nodded. "One at a time. They're sedated, but you can sit with them." Megan followed the doctor down a hallway that seemed to stretch forever, fluorescent lights flickering overhead like dying stars. She saw Stephen first, her boy, her brave, goofy boy who'd never met a soccer ball he didn't chase or a joke he didn't try to tell. He looked so small in that hospital bed, tubes snaking from his arms, monitors beeping in rhythms that sounded like warnings. She took his hand, still warm, still real, and pressed her forehead to his knuckles. "I'm here, baby. Mama's here." Minutes later, she sat beside Angela, her fierce little artist, who painted sunsets in shades Megan didn't even know existed, who asked questions about everything and accepted answers from no one until she'd thought them through herself. Angela's dark hair fanned across the pillow, her chest rising and falling with mechanical precision, machines breathing for her. Megan's tears came then, hot and silent, because if she started sobbing, she didn't think she'd ever stop. She stayed there until a nurse gently touched her shoulder and whispered that she needed to step out while they ran more tests. Megan walked back to the hallway in a daze, her hands still shaking, her mind racing through impossible math. 2 children, 2 failing hearts, one mother who would give anything, sell anything, sacrifice anything, if it meant they'd survive. She slumped against the wall outside the ICU, staring at nothing, thinking everything. "I can't lose them. Not both. Not now. Not ever." The thought wasn't a prayer, it was a vow. The kind mothers make when there's no other option left. She would fight, beg, bargain with fate itself, if she had to. You know that feeling, don't you? That moment when you realize your whole world is balanced on a knife's edge, and there's not a single thing you can do but wait and hope and refuse to let go. If you've ever loved someone so fiercely that losing them would break you beyond repair, then you understand what Megan felt in that hallway. And if you're watching this because you know that kind of love, the kind that makes you warrior and supplicant all at once, then maybe you belong here with us. This community, these stories, they're for women who fought battles nobody saw and carried weights nobody measured. If that's you, subscribe. Not because we're asking for a click, but because you deserve a space where your strength is recognized, where your story matters. But in that moment, alone in a hospital hallway with the smell of antiseptic burning her lungs and the sound of heart monitors echoing from behind closed doors, Megan Katz had no idea that fate was already making moves. She couldn't see that 3 floors below, another life was hanging by a thread, and that the man she'd spent 9 years trying to forget was about to become the only answer to a question she didn't know how to ask. The ICU waiting room at 11 p.m. felt like a purgatory designed by someone with no imagination. Beige walls, buzzing fluorescent lights, a coffee machine that hadn't worked since Tuesday. Megan sat in the same plastic chair she'd occupied for 8 hours, her back aching, her eyes burning from tears she'd already cried, and new ones that kept threatening to spill. Dr. Mendoza had checked in twice since the initial diagnosis. Both times, the news was the same: stable but deteriorating. The twins were holding on, but their hearts were failing faster than anyone had predicted. Hours, maybe days, that's what the doctor had said when she thought Megan couldn't hear her talking to the cardiac team outside the ICU doors. Megan stared at the vending machine across from her, at the row of candy bars she'd never let the kids eat, and felt a memory slam into her chest with the force of a freight train. "You're too strict with them," Rick had said once, years before the twins were even a possibility, back when they were just 2 people drunk on each other and the future. They'd been in his penthouse kitchen, all granite and steel, everything expensive and cold, and Megan had been teasing him about the lack of real food in his refrigerator. "When we have kids, they're not living on protein bars and conference calls." Rick had laughed, pulling her close. "When we have kids," he'd repeated, like it was a promise. I liked the sound of that. Megan's throat tightened. She hadn't thought about that moment in years, had buried it under layers of anger and survival, and the daily grind of single motherhood. But sitting here now, watching the clock tick toward midnight, while her children fought for their lives, the past came flooding back, whether she wanted it to or not. She'd met Rick Washington at a charity gala she'd been catering, one of those glittering events where the wealthy wrote checks to feel good about themselves, while servers like Megan refilled champagne flutes and pretended to be invisible. Rick had been different. He'd looked her in the eye when she poured his drink, asked her name, made her laugh with a joke about the overpriced appetizers. 3 weeks later, they were inseparable. 3 months after that, she'd moved into his penthouse. He was building something then. Washington Dynamics was still in its early stages, just a tech startup with big ideas and bigger ambitions. Rick worked 18-hour days, survived on 4 hours of sleep, and somehow still found time to take Megan to hole-in-the-wall diners at 2 a.m. when the corporate dinners left him hungry for something real. She'd loved him with the kind of intensity that only comes once, if you're lucky. The kind that makes you believe in forevers. But Rick's ambition was a living thing, and it grew faster than their relationship could sustain. Board meetings became more important than date nights. Investors took priority over conversations. And then Paul, Rick's ruthless CFO, a man who looked at people like they were quarterly projections, started whispering in Rick's ear about image, about trajectory, about how relationships were liabilities for men on their way to the top. Megan had felt herself becoming an inconvenience long before Rick said the words. The night she found out she was pregnant, she'd stood in the bathroom of that cold penthouse, staring at 2 pink lines, her hands shaking with equal parts terror and hope. She'd imagined telling Rick, pictured his face breaking into that rare, genuine smile he saved for moments that mattered. She'd walked into his office at midnight, where he was drowning in spreadsheets and projections, and said the words that should have changed everything. Rick, I'm pregnant. He'd gone completely still. Not shocked, just still, like someone had hit pause on his life. And then he'd looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not anger, not joy, but something worse. Calculation. We need to think about this rationally, he'd said, and those 6 words had killed something inside her she didn't know could die. She didn't wait for him to finish the thought. She'd left that night, packed everything she could fit in 2 suitcases, and sent him one text from a bus station 3 hours outside the city. I'm pregnant. I'm keeping them. Don't contact me. She'd waited for a response. Some part of her, the part that still loved him, had waited for him to fight for them, to show up, to prove that ambition hadn't completely consumed his soul. The response never came. So Megan built a new life, found a tiny apartment in a town where nobody knew her name or Rick's, worked 2 jobs while her belly grew, gave birth to Stephen and Angela on a rainy April morning with only a nurse and a social worker in the room. No family, no father, no witnesses to the moment her heart split in 2 and reformed around 2 new tiny heartbeats. She'd named them herself, raised them alone, taught them to ride bikes and tie their shoes, and believe they were wanted, loved, enough even without a father who couldn't be bothered to reply to a text message. For 9 years, she'd been enough. And now she was sitting in a hospital waiting room, watching her children's lives drain away, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. A nurse passed by, and Megan caught a glimpse of Stephen's room through the window. He looked so small under those white sheets, his chest rising and falling with mechanical rhythm, machines doing the work his heart couldn't. Angela was 2 doors down, just as small, just as fragile. Megan pressed her palms against her eyes and tried to breathe through the panic clawing at her ribcage. She'd survived Rick leaving. She'd survived poverty and exhaustion and the kind of loneliness that made her bones ache. But this, losing both of them? She wouldn't survive this. Mrs. Katz? Megan's head snapped up. Dr. Mendoza stood in front of her, but something about her expression was different. Not the careful sympathy from earlier, but something stranger. Tension mixed with uncertainty, like she was holding information she didn't quite know how to deliver. Megan was on her feet before she realized she'd moved. Are they okay? Did something happen? They're stable, doctor, Mendoza said quickly. But her eyes darted away for just a second. The kind of tell that meant there was more to the story. But I need to talk to you about a development. Megan's heart stuttered. What kind of development? Dr. Mendoza gestured toward a small consultation room off the main hallway. The kind of room where they delivered news that required privacy, tissue boxes, and closed doors. Megan felt her stomach drop as she followed the doctor inside. The room was small, windowless, lit by the same harsh fluorescent bulbs that seemed to exist in every corner of this hospital. Doctor. Mendoza closed the door and turned to face Megan with an expression that was part relief, part dread. We found a potential donor, she said carefully. Relief crashed through Megan so hard her knees almost buckled. You found both of them? Someone compatible with both Stephen and Angela? Yes. Dr. Mendoza's voice was steady, but her hands were clasped too tightly in front of her. Her shoulders too tense. The match is highly unusual. Genetic compatibility is nearly perfect for both children. That's good, right? Megan heard the desperation in her own voice. The way hope was already rebuilding itself in her chest. That's what we need. When can we? There's a complication, Dr. Mendoza interrupted gently. The donor. He's here. In this hospital. He was brought in earlier tonight after a severe car accident. Megan's relief fractured into confusion. So he's alive? Barely. Dr. Mendoza paused, choosing her words with the precision of someone walking a verbal minefield. His injuries are critical. Without intervention, he won't survive the night. But his heart genetically, it's a perfect match for your children. We've never seen compatibility like this outside of immediate family. The words landed slowly, each one sinking into Megan's consciousness like stones dropping into still water. Immediate family. Who is it? Megan's voice came out as barely a whisper. Dr. Mendoza met her eyes, and in that moment, Megan saw something she couldn't quite name pity, maybe, or the kind of weariness that comes from delivering news that will shatter someone's carefully rebuilt world. There may be one match, Dr. Mendoza said quietly, but Mrs. Katz, it's complicated. Sometimes fate doesn't ask if you're ready. It just shows up with impossible choices and expects you to be strong enough to make them. And here's what I've learned after all these years. The women who survive those moments don't do it alone. They find each other, they share their stories, they build communities where impossible isn't the end of the conversation, it's just the beginning. If you're still here, still watching, still holding your breath waiting to see how Megan survives what's coming next, then maybe you need this community as much as it needs you. Hit that like button if this story is already hitting too close to home. Share it with someone who understands what it means to face the impossible. Because we're just getting started, and something tells me you're going to want company for what comes next. Megan followed Dr. Mendoza down a different corridor, one she hadn't walked yet, away from the ICU and toward the trauma wing. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, moving on autopilot while her mind spun through impossible calculations. A donor, here, now, genetically perfect for both her children. Immediate family. The words echoed in her skull like a warning bell she should have heard sooner. Dr. Mendoza stopped in front of a door marked Consultation Room C and turned to face Megan with an expression that looked almost like an apology. Before we go in, I need you to understand that what you're about to see is difficult. The donor is critically injured. He may not survive the night, even with intervention. Just tell me who it is, Megan said, her voice harder than she intended. Dr. Mendoza's hand hovered over the door handle. Mrs. Katz, the donor's name is Rick Washington. The floor tilted. Megan's hand shot out to grip the wall, her breath leaving her lungs in one sharp exhale. No. I'm sorry. No. The word came out louder this time, desperate and disbelieving. That's not possible. Rick doesn't, he's not. But Dr. Mendoza was already opening the door, and Megan's protests died in her throat because suddenly she was looking at him. Rick Washington lay on a gurney in the center of the small room, surrounded by monitors that beeped in arrhythmic patterns that sounded like warnings. An oxygen mask covered the lower half of his face, fogged with each shallow breath. His left arm was in a temporary splint, his chest wrapped in bandages that were already seeping red at the edges. A gash across his forehead had been stitched hastily, the skin around it swollen and bruised in shades of purple and black. But it was him. Unmistakably, devastatingly, him. Older than she remembered, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 9 years ago, gray threading through his dark hair at the temples. But the same sharp jaw, the same broad shoulders, the same hands that had once held her like she was something precious. Those hands were shaking now, fingers twitching against the white sheet, an IV line taped to his wrist. A police officer stood in the corner, notepad in hand, watching with the careful attention of someone waiting for a statement. 2 paramedics lingered near the door, one holding a tablet, the other glancing between Rick and the monitors, with the kind of tension that meant things were bad and getting worse. Mr. Washington was pulled from his vehicle approximately 4 hours ago, Dr. Mendoza said quietly, her voice taking on the clinical tone doctors used when emotions were too big to let in. Single car accident on the bridge during the storm. Severe internal injuries, multiple fractures, significant blood loss. He's been stabilized, but his prognosis is, she paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like a death sentence. Guarded. Megan couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't process the impossibility of Rick Washington, the man she'd spent 9 years hating, the man who'd chosen everything over her, and their unborn children, lying broken and dying 15 feet away from the twins he'd never met. The genetic compatibility is extraordinary, Dr. Mendoza continued. We ran the tests 3 times to be sure. His heart is a perfect match for both Stephen and Angela. We've never seen compatibility this strong outside of parents, Megan whispered. Dr. Mendoza nodded slowly. Yes. The room spun. Megan gripped the edge of a chair to steady herself, her knuckles white, her whole body trembling with the weight of understanding crashing down on her. Rick was the twins' father. Of course his heart matched theirs. And he was dying. As if sensing her presence, Rick's eyes fluttered open just barely, the effort clearly costing him. His gaze, unfocused at first, drifted across the room until it landed on her face. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. His whole body tensed, and behind the oxygen mask, his lips moved, shaping a word that came out as barely a rasp. Megan. She flinched as if he'd struck her. Hearing her name in his voice, even broken, even destroyed, felt like being dragged back through time to the moment she'd walked out of his penthouse and sworn she'd never look back. Get out, she said, the words tearing out of her throat before she could stop them. You don't get to say my name. You don't. Please. Rick's voice was so weak it barely registered above the beeping monitors, but the desperation in it cut through everything else. He tried to lift his hand toward her and grimaced in pain, the movement sending alarms spiking on the machines around him. Mr. Washington, you need to stay still, Dr. Mendoza warned, stepping closer to adjust his IV. But Rick's eyes never left Megan's face. Please, he said again. I need to talk to her. You don't get to need anything from me. Megan spat, but her feet were already carrying her closer to the gurney, against every instinct, screaming at her to run. You had 9 years to talk to me, Rick. 9 years to show up, to ask, to care. I know. The words came out choked, thick with something that sounded like regret, but felt like too little, too late. I know, and I'm sorry. God, Megan, I'm so sorry. Sorry? She laughed, a brittle sound that cracked in the middle. You think sorry fixes this? You think sorry makes up for? Her voice broke, and she hated herself for it, hated him for making her feel this again. They're dying, Rick. Stephen and Angela are dying, and you're lying here like some kind of sick, cosmic joke. They're mine. It wasn't a question. Rick's eyes, glassy with pain and something deeper, held hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. Stephen and Angela, they're my children. Megan's breath caught. How do you? I knew. The confession came out on an exhale that sounded like he'd been holding it for years. I've always known. The room tilted again. Megan grabbed the rail of his gurney to keep from falling, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. You knew? I got your message. Rick's words came faster now, urgent, like he was running out of time to say them, and maybe he was, because the monitors were starting to alarm again. And Dr. Mendoza was watching him with increasing concern. The night you left. I read it. And I froze, and by the time I came to my senses and tried to find you, you were gone. You never replied. Megan's voice was barely a whisper now, all the rage draining out of her, and leaving only hollow devastation in its place. You never? I was scared. Rick's hand found hers, somehow, his fingers cold and trembling, but gripping tight. I was 27 and drowning in board meetings and investor calls, and Paul was in my ear every day telling me that a family would destroy everything I'd built. I was a coward, Megan. I was young and stupid, and I let him convince me that my empire mattered more than. His voice cracked. More than you, more than them. Megan wanted to pull her hand away, wanted to hate him with the same pure fury she'd carried for 9 years. But standing there, looking down at the broken man who'd once been her entire world, all she felt was tired. I tried to find you, Rick continued, his grip tightening. After the company went public, and I finally had the power to tell Paul to go to hell, I tried. I hired investigators. I searched every hospital record, every birth certificate I could access. But you disappeared completely, and I thought," he closed his eyes, a tear sliding down his bruised cheek. "I thought maybe that was what you wanted, to be free of me." "I wanted them to be free of you," Megan said, "but there was no venom left in it, just truth, raw and painful. I didn't want them growing up wondering why their father chose money over them. I've followed them anyway." Rick's eyes opened again, clearer now, despite the pain. "School events. Birthday parties. I have photos on my phone, every picture you ever posted. Every moment I could steal from a distance. I've watched them grow up, Megan. And I've hated myself, every day, for not being brave enough to—" A violent cough racked his body, cutting off the words. Blood flecked the inside of his oxygen mask. The monitors screamed. "Mr. Washington." Dr. Mendoza was at his side instantly. Adjusting tubes, checking vitals, her calm veneer cracking just slightly. The paramedics moved in, one pulling out emergency equipment, while the other called for backup. Megan stood frozen, Rick's hand still gripping hers. His blood on her fingers now from where his IV had partially pulled free. "Mrs. Katz, I need you to step back," Dr. Mendoza said. But Rick's grip tightened, refusing to let go. "Wait." The word came out strangled, desperate. Rick's eyes found Megan's through the chaos. And in them, she saw everything he'd never said. Every apology, every regret, every moment he'd spent watching from the shadows while his children grew up without him. "Megan, please. Let me do this. Let me save them." "Rick, I've already signed the forms." His breathing was getting shallower, each word costing him more. "Before they brought me here, organ donor. But I need you to know, it's not guilt. It's not," another cough, more blood. "It's love. I've loved them since the moment I knew they existed. I just didn't know how to show it." Tears were streaming down Megan's face now, hot and unstoppable. "This isn't fair. You don't get to do this. You don't get to be the hero after." "I'm not the hero." Rick's smile was sad, broken, real. "You are. You've kept them alive for 9 years. Let me keep them alive now." His grip weakened, his eyes starting to flutter. "Let me do one good thing. Megan, please, let me save them." The monitors flatlined. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Dr. Mendoza shouting orders, paramedics moving with practiced efficiency, hands pushing Megan back as they worked to restart Rick's heart. And Megan stood there, Rick's blood still warm on her hands, watching the man she'd spent 9 years trying to forget fight to save the children he'd spent 9 years loving from afar. The word tore from her throat before she even knew she'd made the decision. Save him. Do whatever you have to do, just save him long enough to save them. Because fate had brought them here to this impossible moment, this unbearable choice, and Megan Katz was done fighting it. And maybe that's what strength really looks like. Not the ability to hold on to anger forever, but the courage to let it go when something bigger than your pain demands it. I've watched women make impossible choices for decades, choosing their children's futures over their own comfort, choosing forgiveness when they had every right to hold grudges, choosing to see the complicated truth instead of the simple villain. It takes a particular kind of bravery to stand in a hospital room and choose mercy for the man who broke you. If you've ever had to make that choice to put aside your hurt for someone you love more than your own wounded heart, then you know what Megan's feeling right now. And if you're watching because you understand that sometimes love means choosing the impossible thing, drop a comment below. Tell us about a time you chose love over anger, because those stories, they're the ones that save us all. The medical team worked on Rick with the kind of controlled urgency that came from years of saving lives on borrowed time. Defibrillator pads pressed against his chest. Commands shouted in medical shorthand. The sharp smell of antiseptic mixing with something metallic blood, fear, desperation. Megan stood pressed against the wall, her hands shaking, Rick's blood still warm on her fingers. She'd told them to save him. The words had left her mouth before her brain could catch up, before she could examine what it meant to want Rick Washington alive. After 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours, the monitor's flat line erupted into an erratic but present heartbeat. "We've got him back," Dr. Mendoza announced, her voice steady despite the sweat beading on her forehead. "But he's extremely unstable. We need to move fast." The paramedics stepped back, The police officer in the corner shifted his weight, notebook still in hand, and Rick's eyes opened again, unfocused, glazed with pain and medication, but open. His gaze found Megan immediately, like she was the only fixed point in a spinning room. She should have walked away. Should have let the doctors handle the medical side while she returned to her children, to Stephen and Angela, who needed her more than this broken man ever had. But her feet carried her back to his gurney instead. "You said you knew." Her voice came out raw, barely above a whisper. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but now it was tangled with something more complicated: confusion, betrayal, and the terrible weight of wasted years. "You said you've always known about them. So why, Rick? Why didn't you find us?" Rick tried to sit up, and immediately gasped in pain, his hand clutching at the bandages across his ribs. Dr. Mendoza moved to stop him, but he waved her off weakly. "I tried," he said, each word costing him. "God, Megan, I tried." "You tried?" The words tasted bitter. "One text, Rick. I sent you one message telling you I was pregnant, and you couldn't even—" "I got it." Rick's interruption was fierce, despite his weakness. "I got your message at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday. I remember because I was in the middle of a board meeting that Paul insisted couldn't wait. I read those 3 sentences. I'm pregnant. I'm keeping them. Don't contact me," and my whole world stopped. Megan's breath caught. She'd never known the exact moment, never knew if he'd read it immediately, or days later, or ever. "I left the meeting," Rick continued, his eyes locked on hers, with an intensity that made her chest ache. "Paul followed me out, asking what was wrong, and He closed his eyes, shame written across every bruised line of his face. "I told him. I don't know why. Maybe because I was terrified, and he was the closest thing I had to family at the company. Maybe because I needed someone to tell me it would be okay." "And what did he tell you?" Megan already knew the answer, could feel it settling like ice in her stomach. "He told me that children would destroy everything we'd built, that investors would see me as unstable, uncommitted, that the tech world doesn't forgive young CEOs who get distracted by family drama." Rick's jaw clenched. "He said you were probably lying, trying to trap me, that I should wait, verify, protect myself legally, before responding. And you listened to him. It wasn't a question." "I was 27 and drowning." Rick's voice cracked. "The company was 3 months from either going public or going under. I had 200 employees depending on me, investors breathing down my neck, and Paul whispering in my ear every day that one wrong move would cost everyone everything." He opened his eyes again, and they were wet. "So I waited. Just a few days," I told myself, just until I could think clearly. Those few days turned into 9 years. "No." Rick shook his head, then grimaced at the movement. "Those few days turned into me finally coming to my senses and trying to call you only to find your number disconnected. I went to your apartment, but you were gone. I hired investigators, but you'd vanished completely. No forwarding address, no paper trail, nothing." Megan felt something crack inside her chest. "You're lying." "I'm dying," Rick said simply. "I don't have time left for lies." The police officer cleared his throat from the corner, drawing their attention. Officer Rodriguez, according to his badge, stepped forward with his notebook open. "Mr. Washington, if you're up to it, we need to ask you a few questions about the accident." Rick's expression darkened. It wasn't an accident. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples of implication spreading through the room. Megan's hands gripped the gurney rail. "What?" "The other car forced me off the bridge," Rick said, his voice gaining strength despite his injuries. "Black sedan, no plates. It came out of nowhere during the storm and ran me into the guardrail. I tried to correct, but—" He gestured weakly at his broken body. Officer Rodriguez nodded grimly. "We suspected as much. Witnesses reported seeing a vehicle flee the scene. We're looking into corporate sabotage, Mr. Washington. Your CFO, Paul Hendricks, has been making some questionable moves at Washington Dynamics over the past few months. Quietly selling off shares, restructuring board positions without your approval." "Paul!" Rick's face went hard. "He found out I was planning to step down, to restructure my life, to finally—" His eyes found Megan's again. "To finally do what I should have done 9 years ago." "Which was what?" Megan heard herself ask. "Find you, Meet my children. Beg you to let me be part of their lives, even if you never forgave me." Rick's hand reached for hers again, trembling. "I was going to tell Paul to go to hell and walk away from the company if that's what it took. But he must have found out, and he tried to kill you." Dr. Mendoza finished the sentence, her expression horrified. Officer Rodriguez was already on his radio, calling for backup, requesting warrants. But Megan couldn't focus on any of it. Her mind was reeling, trying to rearrange 9 years of carefully constructed narrative, Rick as the villain, Rick as the man who'd abandoned them without a second thought into this new, more complicated truth. Rick as someone who'd tried to find them. Rick as someone who'd been manipulated by people he trusted. Rick as someone who'd been coming back. "I don't." Megan's voice failed her. She pressed her free hand to her forehead, trying to stop the room from spinning. "I don't know if I can believe this." "Then believe this." Rick released her hand, and, with visible effort, reached for his jacket, the blood-stained, torn leather jacket that had been cut away from his body and was now folded on a nearby chair. His fingers fumbled with the inside pocket. Dr. Mendoza started to object, but Rick was already pulling something free, a wallet, brown leather, worn at the edges. He handed it to Megan with shaking fingers. She took it, her heart hammering, and opened it slowly. Inside was his driver's license, a few credit cards, and tucked into the photo sleeve. Her breath left her lungs. Photos, at least a dozen of them, printed small to fit in the wallet's plastic sleeves. Stephen at his elementary school graduation, gap-toothed smile, bright as sunshine. Angela at an art show, holding up a painting of a sunset in impossible colors. Both twins at a park, playing on the swings, their laughter almost audible through the still image. Stephen's soccer game from last month. Angela's birthday party from this past summer, frosting on her nose. Photos Megan had posted once, briefly, on a semi-private social media account before she'd deleted it, paranoid about being found. Photos Rick had somehow accessed, saved, printed, and carried with him every single day. "I've watched them grow up through screens and stolen moments," Rick whispered. "I've memorized their faces. I know Stephen likes soccer and terrible jokes. I know Angela paints like she's trying to capture something the rest of us can't see. I know they have your courage and my stubbornness, and I know," his voice broke completely, "I know I don't deserve to meet them. But I've loved them every day since you told me they existed." Megan's tears fell onto the photos, blurring the images of her children, his children smiling up at her from another man's wallet. "Why didn't you try harder?" The question came out broken. "Why didn't you?" "I was scared you'd tell me no." Rick's confession was raw, honest, devastating. "I was scared you'd look at me the way you're looking at me now, and tell me I'd waited too long, that I'd lost my chance. And I thought..." He closed his eyes. "I thought watching from a distance was better than risking you disappearing again. I was wrong. I've been wrong about so many things." Dr. Mendoza stepped forward, her expression apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're running out of time. Mr. Washington, your condition is critical. We need your consent for the transplant procedure, and we need it now." Rick's eyes opened, clearer now despite everything. "The consent forms Paul mentioned, the ones I signed when I got my driver's license renewed last year, those aren't enough? They authorize general organ donation, Dr. Mendoza explained gently. But this is a unique situation. You're still alive, and we need explicit consent for a directed donation to Stephen and Angela specifically. It's legally and ethically complicated, and we need your signature while you're conscious and capable of informed consent." Rick nodded slowly. "Then bring me the forms." "Rick," Megan started, but she didn't know how to finish the sentence. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw everything they'd been and everything they'd never get to be, the love they'd shared, the family they could have built, the 9 years that had been stolen by fear and manipulation and terrible timing. "Let me do this," he said softly. "Let me give them the one thing I never could before. Let me save them, Megan. Please." And Megan, standing in a hospital consultation room at midnight, holding a wallet full of stolen moments and broken dreams, realized that sometimes love doesn't look like fairy tales. Sometimes it looks like a dying man signing papers to save the children he'd loved from the shadows. Sometimes it looks like forgiveness you're not ready to give but choose to offer anyway. "Bring the forms," she told Dr. Mendoza, her hand still gripping Rick's, his blood and tears mixing with her own. Because whatever else Rick Washington had been, whatever mistakes he'd made, whatever fear had kept him away, he was here now. And their children were running out of time. Dr. Mendoza returned 3 minutes later with a clipboard thick with legal documents, a witness nurse trailing behind her. The forms were standard organ donation consent papers. But there was nothing standard about this moment, nothing ordinary about a father signing away his life to save the children he'd never held. Rick's hand was shaking worse now, tremors running through his whole body like aftershocks from an earthquake. The monitors beside him beeped erratically, numbers dropping and spiking in patterns that made Dr. Mendoza's jaw tighten. "We need to do this quickly," she said, placing the clipboard on the gurney beside Rick's hip. "Mr. Washington, do you understand what you're consenting to?" Rick nodded, but his eyes never left Megan's face. "I'm giving my heart to Stephen and Angela Katz, my children." The words "my children" landed like a confession and a claim all at once. Megan felt tears burning behind her eyes again, her throat closing around everything she wanted to say and couldn't. Dr. Mendoza clicked her pen. "The procedure is experimental. We'll be using a cardiac tissue splitting technique that's only been successfully performed twice before. There are significant risks, and the survival rate—" "I don't care about the risks to me," Rick interrupted, his voice gaining strength, despite the blood seeping through his bandages. "I care about the risks to them. Will this work? Will it save them?" Dr. Mendoza hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "If we can stabilize you long enough to harvest the tissue, and if the transplants are successful, then yes. Both children have a strong chance of survival. Then that's all I need to know." Rick reached for the pen with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. He managed to grip it, barely. But when he tried to bring it to the paper, his hand spasmed, and the pen clattered to the floor. Megan bent to pick it up automatically, her movements mechanical, her mind somewhere between past and present, between the man who'd let her walk away pregnant and alone, and the man who was now trying to sign his life away to save the children that abandonment had created. She stood there holding the pen, staring at Rick's outstretched hand, and felt 9 years of carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "I can't do this," she whispered. Rick's face crumpled. "Megan, please, I can't watch you die." The words tore out of her, raw and desperate. "I spent 9 years hating you, and now you're asking me to stand here and help you sign papers that will—" Her voice broke completely. "That will kill you. I'm already dying." Rick's voice was gentle, despite the pain etched into every line of his face. "The doctor said I have hours at best. Internal bleeding they can't stop. Organs shutting down. This crash, whoever did this to me, they did their job well." He tried to smile, and failed. "But I can choose what my death means. I can choose to save them. They need a father," Megan said, and she wasn't sure if she was arguing with him or herself. "Not a ghost. Not a story about a man they never met who died to save them. They need to live." Rick's interruption was fierce, desperate, final. "Megan, I've had 9 years to be their father, and I wasted every single day. I can't get those years back. But I can give them the rest of their lives." His eyes were pleading now, tears streaming down his bruised cheeks. "Please, let me do this one thing right." Megan looked at the pen in her hand, at the forms on the clipboard, at the man who'd broken her heart, and was now asking her to help him give his. "Tell me you're sorry," she said quietly. "Tell me everything you should have said 9 years ago." Rick nodded, struggling to sit up straighter despite Dr. Mendoza's protests. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every regret he'd never voiced, every apology he'd rehearsed in the dark. "I'm sorry I was a coward. I'm sorry I let Paul manipulate me into believing my company mattered more than you, more than them. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder to find you, didn't show up at your door and refuse to leave until you let me prove I'd changed." His breath hitched. "I'm sorry Stephen learned to ride a bike without me. I'm sorry I wasn't there when Angela painted her first sunset. I'm sorry for every birthday, every scraped knee, every nightmare, every moment you had to be both parents, because I was too scared to be one." Megan's tears fell freely now, splashing onto the consent forms, blurring ink that hadn't been signed yet. "I'm sorry I never got to tell them I loved them," Rick continued, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry they grew up thinking their father didn't want them, when the truth is, I've wanted nothing else for 9 years." He reached out, his hand finding hers, gripping tight despite the tremors. "But most of all, I'm sorry I hurt you. You deserved better than silence. You deserved better than me." "I did," Megan agreed, her voice barely a whisper. "We all did." "Then let me give you this." Rick squeezed her hand. "Let me give Stephen and Angela their lives. Let me do the one thing I can never screw up or walk away from. Let me love them the only way I have left." Megan looked at their joined hands, his covered in blood and bruises, hers shaking with exhaustion and grief, and made a choice she'd regret and cherish for the rest of her life. She placed the pen in his palm and wrapped her hand around his, steadying his tremors. Together, they brought the pen to paper. Rick's signature was barely legible, each letter a struggle, but Megan's hand guided his through every shaking stroke. She watched ink form his name, Richard James Washington, in a scrawl that looked nothing like the confident signature she remembered from 9 years ago. This signature belonged to a dying man making a final gift. Dr. Mendoza witnessed it immediately, her own hand steady as she signed beside Rick's name. The nurse added her signature. It was done. Legal, binding, irreversible. Rick let the pen fall and grabbed Megan's hand with both of his, pulling her closer. "Tell them," he whispered urgently, his strength fading visibly now, monitors screaming warnings that Dr. Mendoza was trying to silence. "Tell Stephen and Angela I loved them before I ever met them. Tell them I watched them grow up from the shadows because I was too much of a coward to step into the light. Tell them," his voice cracked, blood flecking his lips. "Tell them their father's last thought was wishing he'd been brave enough to be their first." "Rick," Megan's voice was wrecked, broken. "Promise me." His grip tightened one last time, fierce and desperate. "Promise me you'll tell them." "I promise." Rick smiled, then really smiled, the way he used to when they were young and stupid, and believed love could survive anything. "Thank you," he whispered, "for giving me 9 years of photos, for letting me love them from afar, for letting me save them now." Dr. Mendoza was already signaling to the trauma team waiting outside. "We need to move him now. His vitals are dropping fast." The doors burst open. Medical personnel flooded in. Hands reached for Rick's gurney, preparing to wheel him to the surgical wing, where a team was standing by. Rick's hand slipped from Megan's as they lifted him. As they rushed him toward doors she couldn't follow him through, toward a procedure she couldn't witness. She stood frozen in the consultation room, watching him disappear down the hallway, and the weight of what had just happened hit her all at once. She just helped Rick Washington sign his own death warrant. Megan's knees buckled. She hit the floor hard, her hands pressed against cold tile, her whole body shaking with sobs she couldn't control. 9 years of anger, 9 years of loneliness, 9 years of raising 2 children alone while their father existed somewhere in the world not caring, except he had cared. He'd always cared. And now he was dying to prove it. "Mrs. Katz." A nurse was beside her, hands gentle on her shoulders. "Let me help you up." But Megan couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but break apart on a hospital floor while the father of her children was wheeled away to give them his heart. The nurse's radio crackled, a voice, urgent and panicked. "Code Blue, Pediatric ICU. Patient, Angela Katz. Code Blue, Pediatric ICU. Patient, Stephen Katz." Both twins, crashing simultaneously. Megan's head snapped up, terror replacing grief in one brutal instant. She was on her feet and running before her mind caught up with her body, the nurse's protests fading behind her as she sprinted toward the ICU. She burst through the doors to chaos. Stephen's room was full of medical staff, hands moving fast, voices calling out numbers and commands. Through the window she could see his small body jerking as they worked to stabilize him. Monitors flatlined and screaming. Angela's room was the same, too many people, too much urgency. Alarms blaring like the end of the world. Dr. Mendoza appeared beside Megan, her face grim. "Their hearts are failing faster than projected. We're out of time. Then start the transplant." Megan's voice came out as a command, fierce and final. "Do it now. Rick is being prepped for harvest, but he's not stable enough." As if summoned by his name, a new alarm echoed from somewhere deeper in the hospital. Different, more urgent. Rick's alarm. "He's crashing," someone shouted from down the hall. "Donor is crashing." Dr. Mendoza's jaw set. She grabbed her radio and barked orders in medical shorthand, Megan didn't understand. Then she turned to Megan with eyes that held both sorrow and determination. "We harvest now," she said, "and we pray we're fast enough." Then she was gone, running toward Rick's surgical prep room, leaving Megan alone in a hallway between her dying children and their dying father. And all she could do was stand there broken, terrified, powerless, while three hearts raced toward the same impossible deadline. Time became something Megan measured in heartbeats instead of hours. She didn't know how long she stood outside OR3, watching through glass as surgical teams moved around Rick's body with practiced precision. She didn't know when the nurses finally convinced her to sit down, when someone pressed a cup of cold coffee into her hands, when the pre-dawn gray shifted into actual morning light filtering through windows she couldn't remember looking at. All she knew was that somewhere in this building, surgeons were performing a procedure that had only been attempted twice before, splitting cardiac tissue from one donor to save two recipients. All she knew was that her children's lives depended on whether Rick Washington's heart could be divided into pieces that would still beat. The surgical wing doors finally opened at 9:47 a.m. Megan knew the exact time because she'd been staring at the clock on the wall, watching each second tick by like a countdown to either salvation or devastation. Dr. Mendoza emerged first, still in surgical scrubs, her mask pulled down to reveal a face that looked 10 years older than it had 12 hours ago. But her eyes were wet with tears that could mean anything, everything, nothing. Megan was on her feet before her legs remembered how to work properly. "Are they alive?" Dr. Mendoza's voice cracked on the word, and she let out a breath that sounded like she'd been holding it for hours. "Mrs. Katz, your children are alive." The world tilted. Megan's knees buckled, and Dr. Mendoza caught her, holding her upright while Megan tried to remember how to breathe around the sob building in her chest. "Both of them?" The question came out strangled, desperate. "Both of them." Dr. Mendoza was smiling now, tears streaming down her face openly. "The cardiac tissue splitting procedure was successful. We harvested healthy myocardial tissue from Mr. Washington's heart and transplanted portions into both Stephen and Angela. The grafts took immediately. Their hearts are beating on their own." Megan pressed her hands to her mouth, trying to hold in the sound, threatening to tear out of her part sob, part laugh, part prayer of gratitude to a universe that had finally shown mercy. "They're in recovery now," Dr. Mendoza continued, steadying Megan with gentle hands on her shoulders. "Still sedated, still on monitors, but their vitals are strong. Stronger than we dared hope. The tissue integration is remarkable. Their bodies are accepting the grafts as if they'd always belonged there. Can I see them?" "Soon. The pediatric team needs another hour to stabilize them fully, but then yes, you can sit with them." Dr. Mendoza paused, her expression shifting into something more complicated. "Mrs. Katz, there's more you need to know." The relief in Megan's chest crystallized back into fear. "What? What happened?" "Rick Washington is alive." The words didn't make sense at first. Megan had watched him flatline, had seen his heart stop, had heard Dr. Mendoza order the harvest procedure while Rick's monitor screamed its flat, final note. "That's not possible," Megan whispered. "It shouldn't be." Dr. Mendoza agreed. "We harvested the cardiac tissue we needed, took sections from the right ventricle, and portions of healthy myocardium that could be split between the twins. But Mr. Washington's heart." She shook her head, like she still couldn't quite believe what she was about to say. "It started beating again. Weak, irregular, barely sustaining life, but beating." Megan felt like the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. "How?" "We don't know. The human body is capable of extraordinary things under extreme circumstances. Some deeply primitive part of his brain refused to let go." Dr. Mendoza's voice was soft, almost reverent. "He's in a coma, Mrs. Katz. Critical condition. Brain activity is minimal, and there's significant damage from blood loss and organ failure. But he's alive. Take me to him." Sometimes miracles don't look like we expect them to. Sometimes they're messy and incomplete, and wrapped in complications we're not ready to handle. But they're still miracles. If you've made it this far in this story, still holding your breath through every twist, still feeling Megan's pain and hope and impossible choices, then you understand something important. You understand that the stories that matter most are the ones that reflect our real lives back to us. The ones where happy endings come with costs, where victory looks like survival, where love means making choices you never thought you'd have to make. If this story is speaking to you, if you see yourself in Megan, or recognize your own impossible moments in hers, then share this. Share it because someone in your life needs to know they're not alone in their struggle. Share it because stories like this build bridges between women who fought battles nobody else could see. We're in this together. Dr. Mendoza studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. This way. They walked through corridors Megan had memorized over the past day, past ICU rooms she recognized, and surgical wings she'd only glimpsed through glass. Doctor. Mendoza led her to a private recovery room at the end of a quiet hallway, the kind of room reserved for critical patients who needed constant monitoring but couldn't handle the chaos of the main ICU. Rick lay in a bed that looked too small for his frame, surrounded by machines that beeped and whirred in rhythms Megan was starting to understand. Monitors tracked his heartbeat, erratic but present. His chest was wrapped in so many bandages, he looked like someone had tried to hold him together with gauze and prayer. An intubation tube helped him breathe. IVs ran into both arms, pumping medications Megan couldn't name. His face was the only part of him that looked almost peaceful, eyes closed, bruises fading from purple to yellow. The tension that had defined him for 9 years, finally smoothed away by unconsciousness. Talk to him, doctor, Mendoza said quietly. Coma patients can sometimes hear. We don't fully understand it, but there's evidence that familiar voices can help. She squeezed Megan's shoulder once and left, closing the door behind her. Megan stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the man who'd defined half her adult life, first as her everything, then as her villain, and now as something she didn't have words for yet. She pulled a chair up beside his bed and sat down. "Hi," she said softly, feeling ridiculous and raw all at once. "I don't know if you can hear me. I don't even know what to say to you after everything that's happened. But doctor, Mendoza said I should talk, so." She trailed off, staring at his chest, rising and falling with mechanical assistance. "They're alive, Rick. Stephen and Angela, they made it through surgery. Their hearts are beating because you gave them yours." Her voice cracked. "You saved them. You actually saved them." The monitors beeped steadily. Rick didn't move. Megan reached out slowly, her fingers hovering over his hand before finally settling there, careful of the IVs. His skin was cool, his fingers limp, but she could feel his pulse faint and irregular, but real. "I spent 9 years hating you," she whispered. 9 years building a story in my head where you were the villain who chose money over family, who walked away without looking back. And maybe that story was easier than the truth. Maybe it was easier to hate you than to wonder if I'd made a mistake leaving the way I did. She wiped at her eyes with her free hand, tears falling despite her attempts to hold them back. "I'm sorry," she said, "for not telling you where we were, for not giving you a chance to prove you'd changed, for letting Paul win by keeping us apart." She squeezed his hand gently. "But I'm also not sorry. Because I gave Stephen and Angela 9 years of stability and love, and a mother who showed up every single day, and you can't take that from me, even if you wanted to." The machines hummed. The monitors tracked vital signs that rose and fell like waves. "The kids are going to want to meet you," Megan continued, her voice stronger now. "When they wake up and understand what happened, that their father gave them literal pieces of his heart to save their lives, they're going to want to know you. And I'm terrified, Rick. Terrified you won't wake up. Terrified they'll have to grieve a father they never got to meet." She leaned forward, her forehead almost touching their joined hands. "So you have to wake up," she said fiercely. "You hear me? You don't get to do one grand gesture and then die peacefully. You have to wake up and meet them, and be the father you promised you'd be. You owe them that much. You owe us that much." Nothing. No response. Just the steady beep of monitors and the hiss of the ventilator. Megan sat back, exhausted, and closed her eyes. She didn't remember falling asleep, but when she opened her eyes again, the light outside had shifted into late afternoon. Her neck ached from the angle she'd been sitting at, her hand still wrapped around Rick's. She was about to pull away, stretch her cramped muscles, when she felt it. A twitch. So faint, she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. But then it happened again, Rick's fingers moving against her palm, just barely, like someone testing whether their body still worked. Megan's heart slammed against her ribs. "Rick?" His eyelids fluttered. Rick, can you hear me? Another flutter. And then, slowly, painfully slowly, his eyes opened. Unfocused at first, glazed with pain and medication and confusion. But then his gaze found her face, and something like recognition flickered in those brown eyes she'd once loved more than breathing. His lips moved behind the intubation tube, trying to form words that wouldn't come. "Don't try to talk," Megan said quickly, squeezing his hand. "You're in the hospital. You've been in a coma. The twins, Stephen and Angela, they're alive, Rick. They're alive because of you." Rick's eyes filled with tears that spilled down his bruised cheeks. And Megan sat there, holding the hand of the man who'd broken her heart and saved her children, and realized that sometimes the story doesn't end the way you expect. Sometimes, it just begins again. The intubation tube came out 2 days after Rick woke up. Megan wasn't there for the procedure. She'd been with the twins when it happened, watching Angela's eyes flutter open for the first time since surgery, seeing Stephen's hand squeeze hers with strength that hadn't been there before. But when she returned to Rick's room that evening, she found him propped up on pillows, breathing on his own, his voice raw and broken, but real. "They're okay?" were the first words he managed to rasp out when he saw her in the doorway. Megan nodded, her throat tight. "They're more than okay. They're alive because of you." Rick's face crumpled. His hands came up to cover his eyes, and his shoulders shook with sobs that sounded like they were being torn from somewhere deep in his chest. 9 years of regret and relief and grief, all pouring out at once. Megan stood frozen for a moment, watching this billionaire CEO who'd built empires and commanded boardrooms completely break apart in a hospital bed. Then, without letting herself think about it too hard, she crossed the room and sat on the edge of his bed, her hand finding his shoulder. "It's okay," she whispered. "Rick, it's okay. I thought I'd never know," he choked out between sobs, his voice wrecked. "I thought I'd die before I could hear that they were safe, that they'd live, that I'd actually done something right for them." "You saved their lives," Megan said firmly. "You gave them literal pieces of your heart. That's not something right, Rick. That's everything." He lowered his hands, his eyes red and wet, and looked at her with an expression so raw it made her chest ache. "Can I meet them?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with 9 years of absence and 1 night of sacrifice. Megan took a slow breath. "You'll earn that moment, slowly, carefully." Rick flinched like she'd struck him, but he nodded. "I understand." "I don't think you do." Megan's voice was gentle but firm. "Stephen and Angela just woke up from major surgery. They're 9 years old, Rick. They don't know you exist. And when I tell them, when I explain that their father is alive and 3 floors down in this hospital, they're going to have questions I can't answer yet. They're going to be confused and scared and probably angry." "They have every right to be angry," Rick said hoarsely. "Yes, they do. And you're going to have to accept that anger, that confusion, and let them process it on their timeline, not yours." Megan held his gaze steadily. "You don't get to rush this, Rick. You don't get to show up with grand gestures and expect them to fall into your arms. You're a stranger who shares their DNA. Everything else has to be earned." Rick's jaw worked for a moment, and Megan could see him fighting every instinct that probably told him to argue, to demand, to take control the way he'd done in boardrooms for the past decade. But then he nodded again, slower this time. "Okay," he whispered. "However long it takes. Whatever they need. I'll follow your lead, Megan. I promise." Something in Megan's chest loosened slightly. "Okay." The days that followed fell into a strange, new rhythm. Megan split her time between 3 hospital rooms, Stephen's, Angela's, and Rick's. The twins were recovering faster than anyone had predicted, their young bodies accepting Rick's cardiac tissue like it had always belonged there. Stephen was sitting up within a week, cracking terrible jokes that made the nurses laugh. Angela was drawing again by day 9, sketching the view from her hospital window in colors that made Megan's heart squeeze. Neither of them knew about Rick yet. Megan had told them the truth about the transplant, that a donor's heart had saved them both, that they were alive because someone had given them an extraordinary gift. But she hadn't told them who that someone was. Not yet. Rick, meanwhile, was fighting through physical therapy with the same ruthless determination he'd once applied to building his company. The damage from the crash and surgery had left him weak, his body a roadmap of scars and broken pieces that were slowly knitting back together. But he showed up every day, pushed through exercises that made him shake with effort, refused pain medication when it made him too groggy to think clearly. "Why are you torturing yourself?" Megan asked one afternoon, watching him struggle through resistance band exercises that left him gasping. "Because I need to be strong enough to be their father," Rick said simply, sweat dripping down his face. "When the time comes, when they're ready to meet me, I want to be able to stand on my own 2 feet. I want to be someone they can be proud of, not some broken man in a hospital bed who couldn't walk across the room." Megan's guard, so carefully constructed over 9 years, cracked a little more. She started staying longer during her visits to Rick's room, started bringing him updates about the twins, how Stephen had beaten a nurse at checkers, how Angela had painted a sunset that now hung in the pediatric ward, how both of them asked questions about their donor that Megan deflected with practiced vagueness. "Stephen wants to write a thank you letter," she told Rick one evening, settling into the chair beside his bed that had become hers over the past 2 weeks. "To the donor's family. He doesn't understand that the donor is you and that you're alive, but he wants to say thank you anyway." Rick's eyes filled with tears, something that happened less explosively now, but still regularly. "What did you tell him?" "That we'd figure out a way for him to express his gratitude when the time was right." Megan pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket and handed it to Rick. "Angela drew this. It's for the angel who saved us," she said. "I thought you might want to see it." Rick unfolded the paper with shaking hands. The drawing showed 2 children holding hands, surrounded by hearts of every color Angela could find. Above them, a figure with wings, abstract, not quite human, watched over them with what might have been a smile. Rick pressed the drawing to his chest and cried silently, his shoulders shaking. Megan let him. She was learning that Rick's tears weren't weakness, they were the dam breaking after 9 years of holding everything back. 3 weeks after surgery, Rick took his first unassisted steps. Megan happened to be there, watching from the doorway as Rick gripped the parallel bars in the physical therapy room, his face set in determined concentration. One step, then another. His legs shook, his breathing was labored, but he made it from one end of the bars to the other. When he turned around and saw Megan watching, his face broke into the first real smile she'd seen since they were young and stupid and in love. "I did it," he said, breathless and grinning, like a kid who just learned to ride a bike. "You did it," Megan agreed, smiling despite herself. That night, as Megan sat between Stephen and Angela's beds, reading them a story before lights out, Angela interrupted her mid-sentence. "Mom?" "Yeah, baby." Angela's dark eyes, so much like Rick, studied Megan's face with that particular intensity she'd inherited from her father. "The donor who saved us. Are they okay?" Megan's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "You visit someone else in this hospital," Angela said, matter-of-factly. "Stephen and I see you leave our rooms and go somewhere else, and you come back smiling sometimes, which you didn't do before. So I was thinking maybe the donor didn't die. Maybe they're here too." Out of the mouths of 9-year-olds. Stephen sat up straighter in his bed, suddenly alert. "Is that true, Mom? Is our donor alive?" Megan looked at her children, these brilliant, perceptive, impossible miracles, and realized she couldn't keep lying by omission. "Yes," she said quietly, "the donor is alive, and recovering, just like you two." "Can we meet them?" Stephen asked immediately. "Can we say thank you?" Angela added. Megan's heart hammered against her ribs. "Would you want to? Even if it's complicated?" Angela tilted her head. "Mom, they gave us their heart. How could that be complicated?" And Megan thought about Rick in his room 3 floors down, fighting through physical therapy so he could stand on his own when he finally met his children. Thought about the photos in his wallet, the 9 years of watching from shadows, the choice he'd made to save them at the cost of his own life. Thought about how sometimes love doesn't look like fairy tales, but it shows up anyway. "Okay," she said softly. "But not tonight. Soon. When everyone's a little stronger." Angela smiled, that fierce little smile that meant she'd gotten her way, and settled back into her pillows. "Okay. But Mom?" "Yeah. I already forgive them, for whatever the complicated part is, because we're alive, and that's what matters." Megan kissed her daughter's forehead, then crossed to do the same for Stephen, and walked out of their room with tears streaming down her face. She found herself walking to Rick's room without deciding to go there. Found him awake despite the late hour, staring out the window at the city lights below. "They want to meet you," she said from the doorway. Rick's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide. They know? They figured it out. Or at least figured out that you're alive. Megan stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. Angela asked tonight, point blank. And I couldn't lie anymore. What did you tell them? That the donor is alive and recovering, that it's complicated, that they could meet you when everyone's stronger. She crossed to his bed and sat in her chair, exhausted and relieved all at once. And Angela said she already forgives you. For whatever the complicated part is. Rick made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. She doesn't even know me. No, Megan agreed. But she knows you saved her life, and for now, that's enough. Rick reached for her hand, and this time, Megan didn't hesitate. She took it, her fingers wrapping around his, and they sat in comfortable silence while the city lights flickered outside, and three hearts that had almost stopped beating continued their steady rhythm into an uncertain future. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, exactly 4 weeks after the surgery that had saved 2 lives and irrevocably changed 3 more. Megan had spent the previous night preparing Stephen and Angela as best she could, explaining that their donor was someone special, someone who'd loved them even before meeting them, someone whose story was complicated but whose heart was good. She'd avoided saying the word father until Angela had looked at her with those 2 perceptive eyes and asked point blank, "It's our dad, isn't it?" Stephen had gone completely still, his gap-toothed smile disappearing. "We have a dad?" And Megan had nodded, tears already burning behind her eyes. "You have a dad, and he's the one who saved you." Now, standing outside Rick's hospital room with both twins flanking her, Megan felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, with no idea whether there was solid ground or empty air on the other side. "You ready?" she asked, squeezing both their hands. Angela nodded immediately, fierce and certain. Stephen hesitated, then nodded too, though his grip on Megan's hand tightened. Megan knocked once, then pushed the door open. Rick was sitting in the chair by the window, not in bed, she noticed, because he'd insisted on being upright and presentable when he met his children for the first time. He wore actual clothes instead of a hospital gown, though the bandages still visible at his collar, and the pallor of his skin betrayed how much the effort had cost him. When he saw them in the doorway, his whole face transformed joy and terror and love so raw, it was almost painful to witness. "Hi," he said, his voice shaking. Then, as if realizing how inadequate that was, he tried again. "I'm Rick. I'm your father." The words hung in the air like something fragile that might shatter if anyone moved too quickly. Stephen was the first to break. His face crumpled, and tears started streaming down his cheeks, not angry tears, but the kind that come from emotions too big to hold inside. He didn't move toward Rick, didn't pull away from Megan, just stood there crying quietly while his whole body trembled. Angela, meanwhile, studied Rick with the same intensity she brought to her paintings, cataloging every detail, every expression, trying to understand something her 9-year-old brain didn't have words for yet. Then she let go of Megan's hand and walked across the room. Rick froze, his eyes wide, like he was afraid any movement might scare her away. Angela stopped in front of him and reached out slowly, placing her small hand over his chest right where the bandages covered the scars from surgery, right where his heart was still beating, despite everything it had been through. "I can feel it," she whispered. "Your heart. It's beating different than before. Slower." Rick's voice came out choked. "I gave part of it to you and your brother, to keep you alive." Angela's eyes, so much like his, filled with tears. "Why?" "Because I love you," Rick said simply, and the sincerity in those 4 words broke something open in the room. "I've loved you since before you were born. I loved you when I was too scared to be your father. I loved you through 9 years of watching from the shadows, and I loved you enough to give you anything, everything, if it meant you'd live." Stephen made a sound halfway between a sob and a gasp. He pulled away from Megan and crossed the room in 3 quick steps, stopping beside Angela, staring at Rick with red-rimmed eyes. "You could have died," Stephen said, his voice cracking on the last word. "Yes," Rick agreed. "I should have died. The doctor said there was almost no chance I'd survive. But I think..." He reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement, giving both children time to pull away if they wanted. When they didn't, he placed one hand on Angela's shoulder and the other on Stephen's. "I think maybe some part of me wasn't ready to leave you. Not when I'd finally found you. Angela looked at Stephen. Stephen looked at Angela. Some silent conversation passed between them, the kind only twins who'd shared everything from conception to cardiac tissue could understand. Then Angela took Rick's hand, and Stephen did the same. And Rick Washington, billionaire CEO, corporate mogul, man who'd commanded boardrooms and built empires, completely fell apart. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, gripping their small hands like lifelines. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry you had to grow up without me. I'm sorry your mother had to do everything alone because I was too much of a coward to fight for you. I'm sorry for every birthday I missed, every scraped knee I didn't bandage, every nightmare I didn't chase away." His voice broke completely. "I'm sorry I let 9 years go by before I was brave enough to be your father." Megan stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth, watching her children meet their father through tears that blurred her vision. "It's okay," Angela said softly, and the simple grace of those 2 words from a 9-year-old who had every right to be angry shattered what was left of Rick's composure. Stephen nodded, wiping his own tears with his free hand. "You're here now. That's what Mom says matters, showing up." Rick looked past his children to Megan, and the gratitude in his eyes was so profound she had to look away. They stayed like that for a long time, Rick in his chair, the twins standing on either side of him, all 3 of them crying and holding hands, while Megan bore witness to the family that should have been built 9 years ago finally taking its first uncertain shape. "And here's what I want you to understand, if you're still with me. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. Grace doesn't mean there wasn't real harm done. But sometimes, just sometimes, people get a second chance to be who they should have been from the beginning. And the courage it takes to accept that chance, to rebuild from broken pieces, to choose love over resentment, that's the kind of strength that changes generations. If this story has touched you, if you've felt every twist in your own chest, if you recognize these impossible choices because you've made them yourself, then leave a comment below. Tell me what moment broke you open. Tell me what part you needed to hear. Because every comment, every shared experience, every Me Too, builds a community of women who understand that life rarely gives us easy answers, but always asks us to be brave anyway. And that bravery, it deserves to be witnessed. The news broke 2 days later. Paul Hendricks had been arrested on charges of attempted murder, corporate espionage, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The investigation had uncovered a web of financial manipulation stretching back years, millions siphoned from Washington Dynamics into offshore accounts, and ultimately, the hiring of a driver to eliminate Rick before he could expose the theft. Rick held a press conference from his hospital room, his statement brief but decisive. He was stepping down as CEO of Washington Dynamics, effective immediately, turning control over to the board while he focused on recovery and family. The media frenzy that followed was intense, but mercifully brief. Megan had learned to ignore cameras and reporters years ago, and Rick's legal team was ruthlessly efficient at protecting the twins' privacy. 3 weeks after the twins met their father, Dr. Mendoza cleared Stephen and Angela for discharge. Megan brought them home to the small apartment that had been their entire world for 9 years, the place that suddenly felt both too small and impossibly precious. She made them their favorite dinner, tucked them into their own beds, and sat in the living room, listening to their breathing through thin walls, while tears of relief streamed down her face. They were home. They were alive. They were going to be okay. Rick, meanwhile, remained at the hospital for continued rehabilitation. His recovery was slower, more complicated. The trauma to his body had been severe. And while his heart was still beating, it would never be what it was. But he showed up every day to physical therapy, pushed through exercises that left him exhausted, and video called the twins every evening to hear about their day. Megan found herself looking forward to those calls almost as much as the children did. 2 months after surgery, on a quiet Sunday afternoon when the twins were at a friend's house for a birthday party, Megan returned to the hospital. She found Rick in his room, standing by the window without assistance, looking out at the city he'd once commanded from penthouse offices and boardrooms. "Hey," she said softly. He turned, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Hey, where are the kids?" "Birthday party. I have 2 hours of freedom and no idea what to do with it." She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window. "How are you feeling?" "Stronger. Dr. Mendoza says I might be discharged next week if I keep progressing." He glanced at her sideways. "I've been looking at apartments. Nothing fancy, just something close to you and the kids, if that's okay. I want to be nearby when they need me." But I don't want to crowd you. Megan's chest tightened. Rick, I know I don't have the right to ask for more than supervised visits, he continued quickly. I know I have to earn every moment with them. But I want to be present, Megan. I want to show up. I want to be the father I should have been from the beginning. I know you do, Megan said quietly. She reached out and took his hand, not out of fear or necessity, but because she chose to. And you're already doing it. The kids ask about you constantly. Steven wants to teach you chess. Angela's painting something for your new apartment. Though she won't tell me what it is. Rick's eyes filled with tears, that came easier now, less violently. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve their forgiveness, or your patience. Or any of it. Maybe not, Megan agreed, and when Rick flinched, she squeezed his hand tighter. But maybe it isn't about deserving, Rick. Maybe it's about choosing. He looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw the question in his eyes before he asked it. You're choosing to let me be part of their lives, he said slowly. But what about you, Megan? What are you choosing for yourself? She took a breath, feeling the weight of 9 years of anger and hurt, and carefully constructed walls, pressing down on her chest. Then she felt something else, the memory of who they'd been before everything went wrong. The impossible miracle of Rick's survival. The way he looked at their children like they'd hung the stars. I'm choosing to see what happens, she said softly. I'm choosing to believe that people can change, that second chances are possible, that maybe the heart that broke mine is also the one that saved the most important parts of my life. She turned to face him fully. I'm choosing hope, Rick. Terrifying, uncertain, absolutely no guarantees hope. Rick's breath left him in a rush. That's more than I ever thought you'd give me. It's more than I thought I'd ever give anyone, Megan admitted. But here we are, 3 hearts that almost stopped beating, still going, still fighting, still finding their rhythm together. Rick raised their joined hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles, not a romantic gesture, not yet, but something deeper. A promise. A beginning. I'm going to earn this, he whispered against her skin. Every day, every moment. I'm going to prove that choosing me wasn't a mistake. You already have, Megan said, and realized she meant it. You gave them your heart, Rick, literally and figuratively. Now you just have to show up and love them. That's all they need. That's all I need. They stood together at the window while the city moved below them, and 3 hearts beat in rhythms that would forever be connected, not perfectly synchronized, not without scars, but alive and fighting, and finally, impossibly, whole. Outside, the sun was setting in colors Angela would try to paint later. Shades that existed somewhere between loss and hope, between endings and beginnings. And inside, Megan held Rick's hand and chose forgiveness. Chose family. Chose love that didn't look like fairy tales but showed up anyway. Scarred and imperfect and real. Sometimes the heart that breaks you becomes the only one that can save you. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it learns to beat in time with yours again. 6 months later, the kitchen table was covered in homework, art supplies, and the remnants of after-school snacks when the knock came at 4:15 p.m. right on schedule, the way it had been every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 3 months. Megan didn't need to check the peephole. She knew who it was. He's here, Angela shouted, abandoning her watercolor painting mid-brushstroke and racing to the door. Wait for Mom, Steven called after her, but he was already closing his math textbook and following his sister. His movements easier now, stronger, the breathlessness that had plagued him before surgery, completely gone. Megan reached the door first, blocking it with her body while both twins tried to push past her legs. What do we do before we open the door? She asked, fighting a smile. Check the peephole. Both children chorused in perfect unison, the way only twins could. And make sure it's actually Dad and not a stranger, Angela added with exaggerated patience. Like this was the 100th time they'd had this conversation, which it was. Good. Megan opened the door to find Rick standing in the hallway, looking more like himself than he had in months. The pallor was gone from his face. The bandages had been replaced by scars that were slowly fading. He'd gained back the weight he'd lost, and while he still moved carefully, protecting ribs that had been broken and a chest that had been opened, he stood tall. He wore jeans and a sweater instead of a suit. And Megan had learned that this version of Rick, casual, present, focused on things that mattered instead of things that made money, was someone she was slowly learning to trust. "Hey," he said, his smile automatic when he saw the twins. "How was school?" "Boring," Angela declared, grabbing his hand and pulling him inside. "But I finished the painting I told you about. Come see." "I got an A on my math test," Stephen added, hovering near Rick's other side, "the one you helped me study for." Rick's face lit up with the kind of pride that still made Megan's chest tight. "That's amazing, buddy. I knew you could do it." He caught Megan's eye over the twins' heads, and she saw the question there, the one he asked silently every time he came over. "Is this okay? Am I doing this right? Am I being too much, or not enough?" She smiled and nodded, stepping aside to let him be pulled into their small apartment, into the life they'd built without him, that was slowly, carefully, making room for him now. The routine they'd established was simple but intentional. Rick came over twice a week after school, helped with homework, stayed for dinner, and left by 8 p.m. early enough that the twins didn't feel overwhelmed, late enough that he got to be part of their daily rhythms. On weekends, he took them for outings, parks, museums, movies, always bringing them back on time, always respecting the boundaries Megan had set. He'd moved into an apartment 15 minutes away, close enough to be present but far enough to give everyone space. He'd officially stepped down from Washington Dynamics, sold most of his shares, and now consulted part-time for tech startups, while spending the rest of his energy learning how to be a father. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when Stephen asked questions Rick didn't know how to answer, when Angela's anger about the missing years surfaced unexpectedly, when Megan had to step between her children and their father because the emotions were too big for 9-year-olds to process alone. But it was real. And it was working. Megan watched from the kitchen doorway as Rick knelt beside Angela's painting a sunset in impossible colors, the way only Angela could see them, and listened to her explain every brushstroke with the kind of attention that made Angela glow. Across the room, Stephen was already pulling out his math homework, organizing it on the table the way Rick had taught him, preparing for their study session with the kind of focus he'd never had before. His father had shown him that learning could be something you did together instead of alone. "Mrs. Katz," Dr. Mendoza had said during their 3-month follow-up appointment, studying the twins' test results with something close to awe. "I've never seen cardiac tissue integration this successful. Their hearts are functioning at nearly 100% capacity. Whatever you're doing, the medication schedule, the lifestyle adjustments, the emotional stability, keep doing it." Megan had wanted to say that the emotional stability was the hardest part, that building a family from broken pieces while the whole world watched was exhausting and terrifying, and required more courage than she'd known she possessed. But she just nodded and promised to keep doing it. Because the truth was, the twins were thriving. Stephen had gone back to soccer, his stamina better than it had ever been. Angela had started taking art classes at the community center, her confidence growing with every painting she completed. They attended school full-time, played with friends, laughed at terrible jokes, and fought over bathroom time the way healthy siblings did. They were living the lives Rick's sacrifice had given them, and slowly, carefully, they were letting him into those lives. "Mom, can Dad stay for movie night?" Stephen asked suddenly, looking up from his homework with hopeful eyes. "We were gonna watch that space movie, and he said he likes space stuff." Megan glanced at Rick, who'd gone very still, clearly trying not to influence the decision. Movie night was Friday, 2 days away, and it was sacred. Just Megan and the twins, pizza and popcorn and whatever film they voted on, curled up on the couch until someone fell asleep. It was the routine they'd had for 9 years. Letting Rick into it felt like crossing a line they couldn't uncross. "Please?" Angela added, abandoning her painting explanation to join her brother's campaign. "He's never seen our movie night ritual. We could show him how we do the voting and everything." Rick cleared his throat. "You don't have to. I know movie night is your thing. I don't want to intrude." But Megan saw the hope in his eyes, carefully controlled but present. And she thought about the past 6 months, how he'd shown up consistently, how he'd respected every boundary, how he'd proven that this time he meant it. "Okay," she said, and watched both twins cheer while Rick's face transformed into something between relief and joy. "But you have to follow all the rules, including the one where we argue about pizza toppings for 20 minutes before ordering the same thing we always get." "I can do that," Rick said solemnly, and Megan believed him. Friday came too quickly, and not quickly enough. The twins spent the afternoon preparing Rick for movie night like it was a diplomatic summit, explaining the voting system, the mandatory popcorn flavors, the strategic seating arrangements on the couch. Rick listened with the kind of attention he used to reserve for board meetings, taking mental notes, asking clarifying questions, treating their silly traditions like they were the most important protocols in the world. By the time 7 p.m. arrived, and the pizza was delivered, Megan's small living room felt full, in a way it never had before, not crowded, but complete. They voted on the movie Space Adventure, won by unanimous decision, settled onto the couch, twins in the middle, Megan on one end, Rick on the other, everyone under the same oversized blanket, and pressed play. Halfway through, Steven's head dropped onto Rick's shoulder. Angela had curled into Megan's side, her breathing evening out into sleep. And Megan found herself watching her fractured, impossible family instead of the screen. Rick caught her looking and mouthed, "Thank you." Megan's throat tightened, because she understood what he was thanking her for, not just movie night, but the chance to be here at all, the chance to build something new from the wreckage of what they'd lost. Later, after the movie ended and Rick had carefully transferred Steven to his bed while Megan carried Angela, after the twins were tucked in and the kitchen was cleaned, Rick paused at the door. "I should go," he said quietly, but he didn't move. "Or you could stay," Megan heard herself say. "Just for a little while. We could talk." They ended up on the small balcony off the living room, the city lights flickering below them, 2 mugs of tea going cold between them while they sat in comfortable silence. "They're incredible," Rick said finally. "Steven and Angela. The way they've adapted, the way they've let me in, despite everything. I don't know how you raised them to be so gracious." "I didn't raise them to be gracious," Megan said. "I raised them to be strong. The grace is all them." She paused. Though maybe they learned it from their father, the one who gave them literal pieces of his heart without hesitation. Rick shook his head. "That wasn't grace. That was desperation and guilt. And it was love," Megan interrupted firmly. "Imperfect, late, complicated love, but love nonetheless." She turned to face him fully. "You saved them, Rick. And I know it doesn't erase the 9 years you missed. But it means something. To them. To me." Rick's eyes were bright, with unshed tears. "I never thought I'd get this. A second chance. A family. You." "We're not back together," Megan said quickly, needing to establish that boundary, even as her heart argued otherwise. "I know. We're co-parenting, building trust, taking things slowly. I know. And I don't know if we'll ever be what we were," Megan continued. "Too much has happened. We're different people now." "I know," Rick said again, but he was smiling softly. "But maybe we could be something new. Something better. Something built on truth instead of secrets, on showing up instead of running away." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull back. When she didn't, he took her hand. "I'm not asking for promises, Megan. I'm just asking for possibility." Megan looked at their joined hands, scarred, imperfect, still healing, and thought about hearts that break and hearts that save. Thought about the impossible miracle of Rick's survival, the twins' recovery, the family they were slowly building from pieces that should never have fit together. "Possibility," she repeated softly. "I think I can do possibility." Rick brought her hand to his lips, the gesture familiar now. A promise that had become routine. That's more than enough. They sat together while the city hummed below them, and inside the apartment, 2 children slept soundly with hearts that beat, because their father had loved them enough to give his own. And so we come to the end of one story and the beginning of another. Because that's the thing about life. The endings are never as clean as we want them to be, and the beginnings are always more complicated than the fairy tales promised. But for women like Megan, like you, like all of us, who've had to rebuild from broken pieces and choose hope when every logical part of our brains screamed to protect ourselves, those messy, complicated beginnings are exactly where the real magic lives. If this story has moved you, if it's made you cry or hope, or remember your own impossible choices, then do me one favor, subscribe to this channel. Not because I need the numbers, but because you deserve a community that understands what you've survived. Because these stories of women who chose love over fear, who rebuilt families from ashes, who gave second chances when they had every right to walk away, these are the stories that remind us we're not alone. And you're not alone. You never were. Welcome home. And Megan realized that some stories don't end neatly. Some stories just keep going, imperfect and uncertain and real, teaching you that sometimes the heart that breaks you becomes the foundation for something stronger. Sometimes betrayal transforms into sacrifice. Sometimes absence becomes presence. Sometimes the ending you thought you wanted becomes the beginning you needed all along. The twins were alive. Rick was here. And Megan was choosing every day, in small moments and big decisions, to believe in second chances. Not because anyone deserved them, but because love, real love, isn't about deserving. It's about showing up. It's about choosing possibility over fear. It's about heartbeats that sink not because they're perfect, but because they refuse to stop trying. 3 hearts that almost stopped beating, still fighting, still finding their rhythm, still whole,